In the ashes of the Soviet moon program, an order was given. Erase every trace of failure, destroy all hardware, and hide the embarrassment forever. But deep inside a Russian warehouse, dozens of rocket engines, considered so advanced the West thought them impossible, waited in silence. 2 decades later, American engineers would stumble across this forgotten arsenal, realizing that the engines the Soviet Union tried to erase might be the only thing capable of saving the United States space program. How did technology the Soviets wanted to vanish become a secret lifeline for American rockets? And what really happened inside that warehouse? February 21st, 1969. The first Soviet N-1 rocket rises from its pad, a thunder of 30 engines shaking the Kazakh steppe. 68 seconds later, the sky is ripped open by an explosion so large it leaves a crater where the launch complex once stood. The blast rivals a small nuclear detonation, scattering twisted metal for hundreds of meters. There are no survivors because there were no crew, only telemetry and the hopes of a nation vaporized in a single fireball. 4 months pass, July 3, 1969. As Americans prepare for Apollo 11, the Soviets try again. The second N-1 clears the pad by barely a meter before pogo oscillations rip through the clustered engines. A turbopump explodes, the destruct system triggers, the rocket falls back and detonates on the pad in a blinding white flash. The shockwave shatters glass in nearby towns. The remains of the launch tower are bent like straw. March 1970. The third launch starts with promise, engines roaring, the vehicle climbing into a winter sky. But at just 25 seconds, the central engine fails. The control system, known as CHORD, cannot keep up with the chaos. The rocket begins to tumble, then disintegrates as engines shut down out of sequence. Wreckage rains down across the frozen plain. November 23, 1972. The fourth and final attempt. For 106 seconds, the N-1 climbs higher than ever before. Then a central engine's turbopump tears itself apart. Fuel lines rupture. The rocket veers off course and is destroyed by remote command. Pieces of the world's most powerful booster scatter over 50 kilometers. Each launch is a secret disaster, hidden from the world by the weight of Cold War secrecy. The clustered engine concept, 30 NK-15 engines firing in unison, proves too much for the technology of the day. Pogo oscillations, control system failures, and cascading explosions expose the limits of Soviet engineering under impossible deadlines. The N-1 never once completes a full flight. The dream of a Soviet moon landing dissolves in smoke and debris, leaving only a legacy of failure and humiliation. By 1974, the program is dead. The order comes down: erase every trace, destroy every rocket, every engine, every file. Failure must not be allowed to survive. Nikolai Kuznetsov knew the meaning of orders in the Soviet aerospace world. Directives arrived from Moscow with the weight of law, especially after a public embarrassment like the N-1. But for Kuznetsov, the destruction order was more than a bureaucratic formality. It was the erasure of years of work, the obliteration of a dream built on thousands of engineer hours, and the quiet hope that the next design would finally work. Inside the walls of his bureau, the mood was grim. Engineers packed up blueprints, swept the last scraps of metal from the assembly floor, and waited for the trucks that would haul away the remnants of the failed moonshot. But not everything moved as planned. In the shadows of the cancellation, Kuznetsov made a decision that would define his legacy. Instead of sending every NK-33 engine to the scrap heap, he arranged for dozens to be quietly packed into wooden crates. Officially, they were listed as destroyed. In reality, they were sealed, labeled, and moved into storage, out of sight, but not out of mind. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a silent act of resistance against the tide of institutional defeat. The risk was real. In the Soviet system, disobeying a direct order, especially one tied to national humiliation, could end a career or worse. Yet for Kuznetsov, the engines represented more than failed hardware. They were the product of a decade's worth of innovation, oxygen-rich stage combustion, precision metallurgy, and a thrust-to-weight ratio that rivaled anything in the West. To destroy them would be to deny the possibility that the work could matter again someday for someone. Colleagues would later describe the Bureau as a place where pride ran deeper than fear. Engineers kept the secret, maintaining the engines in climate-controlled silence, occasionally turning shafts and checking seals, as if expecting the phone to ring with new orders. The crates gathered dust, but inside the machinery remained untouched, preserved by a blend of stubbornness and hope. For years, the engines slept through regime changes, economic collapse, and the slow decay of Soviet power. No one outside Samara suspected what was hidden behind locked doors. The official story was that the NK-33 had vanished along with the N-1. Unofficially, Kuznetsov's act of technical defiance ensured that the story was not over. The engines waited, a latent force preserved against the odds, their fate still unwritten. A convoy of American engineers wound through the outskirts of Samara, past rusting fences and silent factories. It was 1995, and the Cold War had dissolved into dust, but suspicion lingered at every checkpoint and in every glance. The team from Aerojet had come chasing a rumor that somewhere in this city, Soviet rocket engines long thought destroyed might still exist. Most expected a graveyard of corroded metal, relics left to rot after the collapse. Instead, the warehouse doors opened onto a scene that felt impossible. Rows of wooden crates stretched into the shadows, stacked with military precision. Each box bore Cyrillic stencils and faded serial numbers, but inside the engines gleamed beneath a thin film of protective oil. The air was cool and dry, the silence broken only by the echo of footsteps on concrete. One engineer later called it a forest of engines. Dozens of NK-33s standing upright, bell to bell, as if waiting to be called to the pad. The engines had been sealed away for over 20 years, maintained with a care that bordered on reverence. Desiccant packets hung from crate lids, grease pencil marks still traced inspection dates from the late 1970s. Even the rubber seals, notorious for hardening with age, felt pliable to the touch. The Americans circled each engine, cataloging details. Welds ran smooth and unbroken across the combustion chambers. Turbopump housings showed no sign of corrosion or fatigue. A few engineers exchanged glances. This was not the work of a bureau that had given up. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep these machines alive. The numbers added up quickly, nearly 60 flight-ready engines, all built for a moonshot that never came. No one expected to find hardware in this condition, not after decades of neglect, not after the collapse of the very state that built them. Doubt crept in. Could these engines really be as advanced as the specs claimed? The oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle, the high chamber pressures, the legendary thrust-to-weight ratios. On paper, they read like science fiction. In the West, such designs were dismissed as impossible, doomed by the risk of catastrophic sooting or metal fatigue. Yet here they stood, untouched by time, promising performance that outstripped anything in the U.S. arsenal. The disbelief was almost physical. One Aerojet engineer reportedly ran his hand along the bell of an NK-33 and muttered, "If these numbers are real, we're looking at a miracle." The discovery demanded verification. Each engine would need to be uncrated, inspected, and tested. No one could trust Soviet paperwork alone. But in that moment, the reality was unavoidable. The graveyard had become a treasure vault. The engines were not only real, they were ready. In the world of rocket science, few phrases carried more skepticism than oxygen-rich staged combustion. For decades, Western engineers called it a fantasy, especially with kerosene as the propellant. Oxygen-rich sounded like a technical dare, and the idea was treated with polite disbelief. The cycle is simple in concept. Burn a small amount of kerosene with excess oxygen in a pre-burner, spin the turbopumps with that super-hot oxygen-rich gas, and then feed it all into the main combustion chamber for a second, complete burn. The payoff is higher chamber pressures, more thrust for the same mass, and efficiency that leaves other engines behind. Efficiency was the promised prize, but the risks were legendary. In an oxygen-rich environment, kerosene does more than burn. It soots, it coaks, it chews through metal. The West's best minds wrote off the cycle as a dead end, convinced that no steel could survive the onslaught of hot, oxygen-saturated exhaust without crumbling to dust. Impossible was the verdict. And then came the NK-33. The engine did not merely survive, it thrived. Engineers at Kuznetsov's bureau solved a metallurgy problem with a high-chromium stainless steel alloy that resisted oxidation under extreme conditions. The result was an engine that ran at 250 bar of chamber pressure, more than twice what American kerosene engines could safely handle at the time. Its thrust-to-weight ratio topped 130-1, a number unmatched in the West for nearly 50 years. The NK-33 weighed 1,200 kilograms, yet it could deliver 1.5 million newtons of thrust at sea level. Its specific impulse reached 331 seconds in vacuum, rivaling much larger and more complex designs. Every detail was engineered for survival in an environment that should have destroyed it. Bearings were cooled with sub-cooled oxygen. Turbopump blades were cast with extreme precision, then coated to resist oxidation. The pre-burner chemistry was tuned so precisely that the exhaust left almost no soot, feeding clean, high-energy gas into the main chamber. Where American engines relied on softer, fuel-rich cycles to protect hardware, the NK-33 ran hotter, leaner, and with fewer moving parts. To American engineers, the datasheets felt like science fiction. Oxygen-rich stage combustion with kerosene had been dismissed as a technical dead end, yet here was a working example, built in the early 1970s, that outperformed anything in their inventory. The Soviet team had not only solved the unsolvable, they had done it quietly, methodically, and with a level of craftsmanship that left Western experts both envious and stunned. Pallets of Soviet hardware arrived at Aerojet's test facility in California under tight security. Each crate carried the weight of a lost empire and a price tag that seemed almost comical, roughly $1 million per engine, a fraction of what it would cost to design anything comparable from scratch. The engineers set to work, stripping away decades of grease, swapping out control interfaces, and wiring American sensors into the heart of the NK-33. The new designation was AJ-26, but the bones were pure Kuznetsov. Skepticism lingered. No one expected a relic from the Cold War to light on the first try. Yet when the test stand clamps locked down and the countdown hit 0, the AJ-26 roared to life. Sensors recorded a flawless ignition. Chamber pressures spiked exactly as the original Soviet documents predicted. There was no sign of corrosion, no hesitation, no catastrophic leaks. After 25 years in storage, the engine performed as if it had just left the assembly line. Test data poured in. Thrust levels, temperature profiles, vibration signatures, all matching or exceeding the published specs. The Aerojet team, used to babying temperamental prototypes, found themselves watching a machine that simply worked. For $1 million each, the Americans had acquired not only a piece of lost history, but a shortcut past years of expensive research and development. The AJ-26's flawless first fire did not just validate the legend, it kicked open the door to a new era of procurement, where yesterday's enemy became today's indispensable supplier. Atlas V rolled onto the launch pad in 2002, its core powered by a RD-180 engine that few in the West could fully explain, let alone replicate. The RD-180, a direct descendant of the Soviet Energia family, became the heart of America's most important launch vehicle. It was no longer just a technical curiosity. Now, it was the foundation of national security and scientific ambition. The United States Air Force certified the Atlas V for military payloads after a series of rigorous tests, entrusting the fate of billion-dollar satellites and classified reconnaissance missions to hardware stamped with Cyrillic script. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter lifted off in 2005. New Horizons followed in 2006, racing toward Pluto. Both rode atop Atlas V, their trajectories shaped by the thrust of an engine born behind the Iron Curtain. Each successful launch deepened the dependency. Congressional hearings grew tense as lawmakers and generals debated the wisdom of staking American access to orbit on a supply chain that began in Samara. The irony was impossible to ignore. After decades of Cold War rivalry, the only engines trusted to deliver the heaviest military and scientific payloads were built by the former adversary. By the end of the 2010s, the ledger spoke for itself. Nearly every flagship mission, planetary probes, spy satellites, even nuclear deterrent payloads, relied on the RD-180. The United States, in pursuit of reliability and cost savings, had tied its most strategic launches to a technology it could not manufacture at home. Each launch was a quiet gamble, a reminder that the edge of American space power rested on the legacy of a buried Soviet moonshot. Production records from the Kuznetsov Bureau show that approximately 60 NK-33 and NK-43 engines were completed between 1969 and 1974, all intended for the N-1F lunar booster. After the cancellation, those engines were quietly moved to storage, their serial numbers logged in ledgers that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. When American engineers arrived in Samara in 1995, they counted nearly 60 engines standing in rows, each one tagged, inspected, and sealed since the mid-1970s. Of these, 43 were purchased by Aerojet, each unit tracked by both Russian export manifests and U.S. import documents. Every engine underwent refurbishment for flight as the AJ-26, and all 43 were certified for launch use in the United States. 39 AJ-26 engines ultimately powered Antares rockets between 2013 and 2017, with the remainder expended in ground tests or decommissioned after qualification. In Russia, the leftover stock, roughly a dozen engines, was reserved for Soyuz 2.1V flights, with the final units consumed by early 2025. No confirmed flight-ready NK-33s remain in any inventory. The numbers, once hidden in Soviet ledgers, now form a closed ledger. 60 built, 43 exported, every last one accounted for by flight, test, or scrap. Today, the United States still relies on foreign-built engines to launch its most vital payloads, even as tensions rise and supply chains fracture. The lesson is clear. Technological supremacy can hinge on yesterday's forgotten choices and today's uneasy alliances. The next leap will not come from hidden warehouses. It will demand vision, independence, and the courage to invest in our own future. What do you think? Share your thoughts below.